we met up on Twitter. You're an Enigma seeker. And it's interesting that how we linked up because we just be in spaces just listening. And I know it just be itching you to say stuff just like it be itching me to say stuff because people be saying some stuff that's nowhere near close to whatever is in the academic world or the
Yeah.
esoteric Gnostic world or any of
Uh,
that, you know?
And
So
I've
it's
kind of
just
learned like on Twitter spaces, at first I was like, oh my God, what am I hearing? And then I'm like, okay, just let these people talk. And it's not, you're not going to be able to say things are too specific because as people have trouble memorizing things and it just becomes more general and broad.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Like, I'm writing a book, and I built my website like 3 years ago, and I built it with one article. I just started with one article, was Sumerians, the first civilization, and I wrote it because in the modern academic world, the Sumerians are considered the founders of the first civilization. So I started with
I
that
debate
one.
that. I argue
Well,
against that.
yeah, and I argue against that too. But what I'm saying in the
I mean, it
modern,
could be the same. Like they came like Egypt and Sumeria came up
yeah,
right about the same time because
and I
there
wrote
is
an
potential
article
news
on it.
coming out of Egypt.
Not only that, I'm glad you said that because see, one thing that I don't like about spaces is that people have to say something with somebody else without somebody interjecting
Oh,
or
sorry. I
interacting
do
because
that a lot.
no, I like that because I'm glad you said that because I believe that too. Egypt and the Sumerian civilization seem to line up around the same time. I actually took a class and I wrote an article about it too that from Alexandria Biblia Dithica. I can never say that university's
Mm,
name over there, but they commemorate the Library of Alexandria over there. And I took a
yeah.
class from there. For the most part, they said that the Egyptian pharaoh dynastic period may have started around 5500 BC. Okay. What is your criteria for civilization?
And that's where I would bring up like Dr. David Miano. He's a YouTuber and he's a historian. And he says it really has a lot to do with the establishment of city states, specifically
Okay.
rounded walled cities because they
Mm-hmm.
had to protect from marauders and bounties and all that stuff, all the crazy geopolitical things. So it's basically like it started as castle like fortresses, but on
Mm-hmm.
flat land. And the recent discovery I know is near northern Iraq. I forgot the name of the new village. They've been studying for over 10, 20 years, but they've now categorized that as a city. Before they're like saying, maybe this is not a city. So
Mm-hmm.
they're debating whether it's a city or not because everything in Iraq is a lot of it's just kind of mud brick and it's all
Yeah.
been,
Mm-hmm.
deconstructed over time.
Yeah. They
But
still live
he
the
would
same
say
way.
cities is a major factor on how you categorize what a city is.
Yeah, that and see, and that's interesting because if you go to the Oxford Dictionary, they have their criteria, right? And then city states is considered also writing systems and laws and certain other things. But then you'll read
Mm-hmm.
about Margaret Mead, who's an anthropologist who says that she thinks, or I know I read something about her saying that she considers the first civilization to be because of a femur that was healed, that somebody took time out of somebody else's life to help somebody's femur, get healed so they can continue to, continue with their life. Most people or most animals, because they consider us animals or species, animals type species, and we would leave that person behind, especially that far back, which she considers maybe about 15,000 years ago.
Yeah, I think that's kind of broadening it way too much because cities refers to being civilized, which
Mm-hmm.
refers to bureaucracies, a
Mm-hmm.
kingdom, scribes, money systems, all the stuff that we have today, but in a simplified version,
Right.
basically. So I would agree. I would probably disagree with that. I mean, yeah, to be civilized, it's like to help each other, and even Neanderthals did that, and
Yeah.
Denisovans to some extent.
Yeah.
But at the same time, even both Neanderthals and humans were very barbaric because of their ideology and their pride. But yeah, but it was definitely I think it has association with people coming together into a specific space and
Mm-hmm.
then building a monument. And Gobekli Tepe has been debated whether do you categorize that as a city or is it really just a temple monument or was the city like 10 miles away and they went to, walk to this area for
Walk
the
there.
temple
Yeah.
monument.
Exactly.
I still think
Exactly.
Gobekli Tepe is some kind of building structure, and I think there's some more people starting to believe. I think YouTuber Ancient Architects, Matt, I think it is. I think he's starting to lean towards that. It might actually be like a building structure that you would go in and it might have had a roof on top of it at one
What
time, but then caved in and people piled stuff into it.
what about the idea that it was a religious site? Because you
Well,
mentioned two things that
yeah, it's
made that stuck out to me.
kind of
You
both.
said barbaric, and you said barbaric and the Neanderthals, and we know how the Neanderthals, it is described how they lived. I read that, and this is on different occasions, that some people consider religion starting because of the Neanderthals were the first ones, or they believe were the first ones to bury people. So that was like a sign to an afterlife because of the relationship with how ancient Egyptians buried their
I
people. So,
Yeah, I
have
would
you heard that
disagree with
before?
that. Yeah, I've heard that one. That
Okay.
actually was presented in one of my anthropology classes, the
Okay.
burial
See, yeah.
practices,
See,
but
so
it's the
you,
specific type of burial practices. If they're
right.
just digging a pit and sticking a
Mhm.
person and they don't put a mound, they don't put rocks around it,
Rocks on
they
there.
don't
Yeah,
put
like a
some kind
stack
of,
of rocks, like some Native
yeah,
Americans used to do, right?
or they would gather certain types of plants and they would put it on the mound.
Yeah.
And some believe that Native American burial mounds, they were actually covered with wildflowers. Like certain, like the women would pick out certain wildflowers like
Mhm.
phloxes or primroses in Texas, and they would actually try to place it on the mound, on the slopes of the
Right.
mound. And then the plateau was more clay and it would be covered with wildflowers. This is still not sure. It's a hypothesis, but I
Right.
think there
Right.
was aesthetic reasons. But with Neanderthals, I think it's more practical. They buried people buried other people back then, even Denisovans. Well, Denisovans still debate because all they have is a tooth and a few little bones.
And you know what?
But
And I'm glad you said that because have you read the book
people
by
make a big
Michael?
deal about that.
Yeah, I'm reading the book Forbidden Archaeology. Have you read that book?
I've isn't there a documentary also
It's
called
like a
that? There's
big,
a
big
channel
man.
probably
I
called
didn't
that.
grab that. I'm
No,
actually in the middle of reading it. So it's by Michael Kramer. I
oh,
can't.
okay. Yeah, yeah, I know.
You know what I'm
I've
talking
heard of
about?
him.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
I haven't
So
read it, but I know who he
man,
is.
that book is so deep, man. I'm telling you, when you said all they have is just this and all they have is just that, it is almost like that. Like it's like one little anomaly that's sitting in the
Yeah,
dirt somewhere, and somebody's
some
like, "Hey,
tooth.
this is this, and this is that, and this," and you're like, "Man," and you want to agree with it, but then you're like, you know, what? Because they always use the possibility of saying that it may not possibly be this, but it may possibly be that. That's basically what I'm getting, you know. And so, not just in that book, but overall, because I took an I like to take a lot of classes from edx.org. I don't know if you know
Hmm.
anything about that.
I've heard them. Yeah, you mentioned that in your videos.
Yeah, I take a lot of their classes because a lot of their classes are free. But then what you can do is you can actually pay for a class, and if you take the test, pass the test, it's you get a certificate saying, "Hey, I passed this class." So it's basically, you
Hmm.
know, you're taking a class, and it's basic. They're giving you the same exact information, whether you know you get the free version or not. You're getting the same exact information. So
Yeah.
I paid for a couple of them for the certificates, you know, just to
Mhm.
challenge myself and stuff like that. But I take a lot of those edx.org classes, and man, you'll get so many different ideas. Like they'll have, you know, what they believe, and then they'll have so many sources that's within there. It's so beautiful to
Hmm.
see that stuff.
Yeah, I think that's pretty interesting. If the internet nowadays, like for certain classes, you don't even have to go to school. It's like all on YouTube or TED Talks, and now you have AI. If that's going to introduce the information that
Have
kind of gets rid of teachers, but I don't think so. I think there'll still be teachers and stuff. The problem is like, when it comes to AI, for example, I was using ChatGPT to figure out where Atlantis and the Garden of Eden is. It
yeah, I
didn't
did too.
quite figure it out, but it did if I asked the right question and I kind of taught it. And so I'll present that in my slide a little bit.
Man, I
But
want to do that too because I was messing with that the other day. I would ask it questions, right, that I knew, right? And stuff that I actually read from my book, from like an academic book, you know, like from Oxford or something like that, right?
mhm,
And it would, if you ask the question one way, it will say no, basically. And then if you
yeah,
rephrase it, you can kind of guide it to say yes. And then if you go back and say, didn't I just
I
say that
that's exactly
earlier?
what's going on.
Yeah. And then
But
when you go,
it's not it's yeah, ChatGPT is if you have to be specific and then it starts to acknowledge like a specific phrase or like if you're trying to say, was this place once called this? If this
Mhm.
was called this, and then it would say yes. but there's inconsistencies in the scholarship and all that, like, because there's no consensus,
Right.
because it's programmed based off what's the institutional authority on certain topics.
Right.
It's already been established that ChatGPT is not going to diverge from that unless you give it something very specific and then you build up the trend. But it always
Yeah.
concludes like, well, not everybody's in agreement. Well,
Yeah.
obviously because of politics and
Right.
ideological differences.
Right.
But this is kind of where I guess kind of getting into my slides here. Like I made this little Photoshop render with from someone's original art piece, but I put this quote here because I feel like a lot of people on the new age or either the white nationalists or even the black nationalists, they failed to kind of look at why are they trying to promote their belief in a certain
Right.
location. And it's because of their original sin. So, like, do you seek that mythical lamb that dwells beneath the restless waves of your original sin? If you
Yeah.
do, then you must first find Eden.
Right.
And that restless wave is that curiosity, because people forget the word sin derives from the word curiosity. That phrase, curiosity killed the cat. Well, it's really sort of with humans. It's applying that too much curiosity leads people in the wrong direction. And that's
Right.
the original sin in the idea of like Adam and Eve eating from that forbidden fruit because they're curious. They want to know if they can gain some power or something like that. And then, it's a trick and they've been deceived. And yeah, so there's a lot of esoteric and philosophical theological ideas, but something to keep in mind. So I always put the image of God, God's all-seeing eye on the Great Pyramid, because actually Dr. Michael S. Heiser is the one that proposed the hypothesis that the Great Pyramid sort of symbolizes a motif of the Garden of Eden, because in Ezekiel, he references that. In Ezekiel, they reference that Eden was referring to the pyramids because the pyramids are located outside the garden.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the garden, the word Eden is not technically the name of the garden. It's saying it's talking about a broader general space, the garden within a certain space. So I can kind of scroll. So these are kind of some of the researchers that first kind of proposed the whole Garden of Eden. And I feel like, if you want to find Atlantis, you have to find the Garden of Eden first. And these are the main scholars that really promoted certain hypotheses. You might have heard of Yuri Zarins. He's from Missouri State University. And I'm also from Missouri now. So he's the one that really popularized the idea of Mesopotamia, which I refute because of reading Ralph Ellis's book and what David Roll, his hypothesis more like, maybe it's something to do with Persia because there's a lot of Persian gardens. And I agree. Yeah, Persia really led the world in garden designs and all that. But then Judy Magnus, she promotes the idea that it's like a temple because there's a temple or burial supposedly tradition of Adam in Israel. But, then again, it's Israel. So, of course, they're going to have some special locations for every biblical figure. So I won't take that too seriously. But she is in agreement with Michael S. Heiser that building structures are associated with gardens. That's definitely true because that's what you put on buildings, architectural motifs of plants. But Ralph Ellis is definitely the one I'm piggybacking off. But the problem is people don't take him seriously because he makes some outlandish claims in some of his other books about Jesus that most scholars would completely disagree. Even the atheist scholars would disagree.
Give me an example.
Well, he says Jesus was an actual king of Israel, and he was like King David, and he was a ruler, and like just some crazy things like that that don't quite make any sense to the actual archaeological record, which the Dead Sea Scrolls are categorized to be archaeological records. There's 950 of them. You don't ignore that. So, but one thing, he does have one thing that's right that fits to me as a landscape architect. Who have studied anthropology, and as a Catholic, this wouldn't contradict my belief at all. And his hypothesis is very sound. But we have to keep things in the context of the supernatural worldview. And the problem with Ralph Ellis is he doesn't have a supernatural worldview, so he wants to look at everything as, Jesus wasn't a god; he was just a literal king. But the Jewish scholars would not agree with that. Michael S. Heiser would not agree with that. So that's where the problem with certain authors, they write too many books, they get confused in their research, and then they might have this right, they have that right, but they have 100 other things wrong. But Ralph Ellis definitely gets the credit on finding the Garden of Eden. He's literally the first one, and ChatGPT found him out, figured it out eventually, but not right away until I kind of nudged it. But this is Yuri Zarins, on the other hand. I disagree with him. He got on National Geographic, on the History Channel. He popularized the whole idea of Mesopotamia, but there's some illogical inconsistencies that actually the documentary did present that Yuri Zarins got some things wrong, like the river's flowing in the wrong direction, and it doesn't make logical sense that it would be in a very arid area. So,
When
but
you say flowing in that opposite direction, are you talking about like how the Nile River is, like how Upper and Lower Egypt is named that way because of the flow of the river?
yeah, well, yeah, because the phrase "a river flowed out of Eden." Now, the question is, what perspective of location are you standing at?
Mhm.
But most of the Jews believed it was going from south to north, which is unusual because most rivers don't flow like that. So that's why
Right.
people are like, does that make sense in the Bible?
Yeah,
Well, it
because
makes
see,
sense if you're looking at the Nile. The current theory is Mesopotamia is the older civilization. So the
yeah,
logic is, well, if they're the older civilization, that must be where the Garden of Eden
yeah,
is.
and
But the
that's where I was
problem
trying to get
is,
it.
it just because it's older doesn't mean it's better in that sense. Like, look at the logic of, America's not that old compared to China, but technologically it's better. It's more powerful. It has so much more influence. Well, that's the same thing with Egypt. Egypt was a lot more powerful than Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia was a lot more warring factions because the space is not as well defined. And that
Mhm.
definitive topological space really shapes the behavior of the geopolitics of its time. And that's where Egypt, in the Bible, they reference. Here, yeah, I kind of scroll to the next slide. But this is Ralph Ellis's book right here, Eden in
Mhm.
Egypt. In the first couple of chapters, he explains how it fits logically that the Gihon is associated with the Nile in some maps as well. And some scholars in Ethiopia, they've always believed, yeah, it's the Nile. But the problem is the Bible says Tigris and Euphrates. Okay, well, you have to put in the consideration that people migrate and they're changing locations and they move
Yeah, they were a
names to
nomadic
other
group of people.
locations.
Yeah, they were nomadic people.
And
Not
they're not necessarily. That's where I think there's a debate about that too.
okay.
They were
Break it
nomadic
down for me.
later.
Okay, later.
So
All right.
yeah, and Ralph Ellis, he was just a surveyor, but he is a biblical researcher. He does know Egyptian, to some extent. He can
Mm-hmm.
actually write it, and he has it in his books. I'm actually learning Egyptian hieroglyphs while I'm reading his book.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is he wants to connect, Akhenaten and Queen Nefertiti as Adam and Eve. But
Mm.
those pharaohs are not that old compared to all the other pharaohs. And Akhenaten definitely was inspired possibly by the Jews and the movement in Egypt of monotheism
Yeah,
and the
that's what I was
believing
gonna
of the
say.
sun god as
Yeah,
the
the
ultimate
sun god.
symbol for God. And I agree with Akhenaten on that and why he did that. It makes logical sense because the Jews were starting to believe that. The difference is Akhenaten wanted to hold on to his nationality, where the Jews wanted to break off of Egypt because of the enslavement process.
Right. Mm.
And again,
Makes
keep in
sense.
mind, this is not European Jews. These were Semitic native Egyptians. So they were dark skinned. They weren't white Jews from Ukraine. So very big difference on that.
No,
So
I'm glad you said that before you start because uh I did I had a discussion with Dr. Keith Chang, and he's the founder of gene SLC2485, and that's basically with the gene where we go from darker complexion to basically lighter complexion, right? And I talked to him a little bit about haplogroups. Do you know a little bit about haplogroups?
yeah, I'm not an expert, but yeah, I've listened to the theories on like how over time albinoism kind of led to divergence of people from more Indian kind of look that were located in Africa with
Mm,
thousands of years ago, and then those haplogroups start to diverge as they're intermixing with possibly Neanderthals, like
mm,
20%. Some people have like I think it's like not 20%, like 5% Neanderthal.
mhm.
Others have a little bit of Sylvan, so they're mixing with those other tribes that were not necessarily human. That starts to change their genetics. Yeah.
Okay. No, that's interesting because now that makes me interested in wanting to read his book since you said he talks a lot about he goes in depth with about what more about Egypt and
Oh, I'm not sure
correlating
about.
with
Ralph Ellis you're talking about.
yeah.
He doesn't really focus on the genetics, no.
No,
But he
not the
focused.
genetics on Eden and the correlation with
Oh
Egypt.
yeah, he definitely does. He's definitely the first to figure it out, and he's got it right. And there is some contradictions, I have to agree. But then again, that's the problem with cultural changes over languages because it could be as simple as when ruler wants a quick map drawn up. These cartographers, they draw simplistic maps. They didn't have satellites. And the ruler says, no, I want that to be named this. Change that name. Okay, well, now we got two Babylons. Okay, now we got two Tigris rivers, two Niles. And that's the problem. These rulers, depending on the culture at the time, they're changing the names, especially it really started with the Persians, really changing a lot of the names up. And then over time, when Europeans came over, the Romans started changing all the names. So it depends. That's what's confusing people. And
yeah,
so I'll
that
kind of
is
present that.
confusing.
I do have to get credit to this one. This is probably my favorite anime that really inspired me to get into Atlantis when I was a kid. So it was the anime director Hideki Anno. He's the one that made Neon Genesis Evangelion. He has a lot of biblical symbolism that's kind of smashed together. But he definitely was doing his research when he made this anime, and he wanted to place the story of Atlantis and Eden in Africa. Because as he was doing his research, he's like, "Well, this makes logical sense. Let's put the mystery back in Africa." So I have to give credit to him. But this brings up the debate in his artistic renderings here of the character Nadia and Jean, a French character. Is the story talking about hunter-gatherers and nomadic tribes, or is it talking about the establishment of civilization? So that's where people, when they read the Garden of Eden story, they have this simplistic idea that, oh, it's just hunter-gatherer kind of basic origin story. But that's sort of true, but that's because in later time periods of the Jews, as they were living more nomadically, when they left Egypt and they started fracturing into multiple tribes around Israel, they lived more nomadically. They didn't live in their temples anymore and all that until they established the state of Israel. So yeah, it really is kind of both here. It's sort of the establishment of hunter-gatherers coming together, specifically those of Anatolia coming down, who are more like kind of white to tan olive skin, and those from Ethiopia region coming up and following the Nile. So they literally just follow the Nile and they collide there. They probably had some wars, and then eventually they unified to some degree and to establish civilization. But it was quicker, I think, in Egypt because of the topography of Egypt and the density of the vegetation. So it is a movement, I think, of like from hunter-gatherers and civilization. So Genesis, when they say the Earth is 6,000, years old, Catholics don't believe that. I don't believe that.
Yeah.
We believe it's more symbolic for the establishment of civilization, and this fits the archaeological record to some degree. 6,000 BC or 4,000 BC is when city-states start to emerge, and that makes sense of the establishment of Genesis, the genesis of civilization. But the authors of the Jews are trying to also relate to a broader symbolic context of the whole planet and the galaxy. And sure, more esoteric kind of ideas on theology. And they're combining the two, hunter-gatherer, and civilization and the whole world, sort of. But in the whole world at their time was very narrow-minded. I mean, they didn't know about China. They didn't know about North America. So you got to put in their context in their perspective.
Yeah, right. And when I'm reading the Hebrew or trying to learn the ancient Hebrew text, I actually did a podcast discussion with Jeff Benner,
I've heard
and
of it,
you know who he is, right? And I actually just spoke to him yesterday, and I'm trying to get a second discussion with him, basically about the Almighty God. But it's amazing because when I read his books and I read what he shares throughout his books, I got 14 of them, and when I read them, he always says basically you can't read the Holy Bible or the ancient Hebrew text in modern eyes or modern concept. You have to place yourself in those people's basically shoes, their sandals, I guess you would say. And you would have to think like how they thought back then. They were a nomadic people. They were an agricultural type of people.
Agriculture, definitely.
Yeah, and
but
had
they did have some dynastic governorship within the world order of Egypt. For example, in the Bible it says Abraham went to Pharaoh. How the hell does Abraham get the right to go to Pharaoh? Unless he was a governor of the regions of Pharaoh that controlled, like around Canaan and Israel. So it starts to make sense. That's where Dr. Michael Heiser would say that the biblical characters are more political characters. They're not just they're leaders.
Yeah.
They're not just part of some kind of, small little nomadic group living in a tent. Sure, in some cases they start out that way, but they got political power. So when they're
Oh.
writing these stories, it's a political allegorical message to
Mhm.
the empire at the time, and that was mainly Egypt and Mesopotamia.
Yeah, I agree with you because you'll find a lot of similarities from Mesopotamia, Egypt into the Indus Valley. There's the Greeks. They couldn't. There's times when I've read that they couldn't distinguish if Ethiopia was in India in Indus Valley or if it was in Africa. Because in some ways they labeled the groups of people that lived in those locations the same way, and they called them, it could have been Ethiopia, it could have been,
Mhm.
Cushites, or whatever the case may be, and you talked about Göbekli Tepe earlier.
Looking at architecturally at Göbekli Tepe, it's sort of unique, but it's not. The architecture is still being refined. It's
Right.
nowhere near the level of Rome or Egypt, obviously. So its style can look similar to what other cultures have, just because of the crudeness.
Mhm.
Okay, Göbekli Tepe is still in the process of advancing its artistic style, and then it stopped. It probably refined. Probably the people from Göbekli Tepe ended up down in Mesopotamia and Egypt. And
Okay.
then they took that knowledge and refined it. So I wouldn't connect it to Australia because I feel like
Yeah.
that's just too far away. You can kind of see pareidolia kind of effects in the architectural style, maybe of some motifs, but it's a blur. It's like when I don't know if you know V on Twitter, but she picks up things, and also David and they try to look like, is there a connection with China and Egypt? Look, they look
Yeah, a lot
Chinese.
of people
Yeah,
do
I
that so
don't.
much, and
Yeah, too
when
much
I
pareidolia. You
yeah
got to
when
put in the context of the rest of the things,
Yeah,
in
see, I'm glad
not
I'm
just
glad I, I'm glad
that.
I get to ask you these questions because it lets me know where your mindset is at, because a lot of people will find one little thing and say, "Oh, this is a similarity," and in a lot of cases, some people might just have the same idea, just in different ways of showing it, but it could be similar, and
Mhm.
it has no relationship to one another at all. Like that happens. Like,
And
I
they're
mean, but
motivated by a lot of people I notice on Twitter Space. They're kind of motivated by their nationality. I mean, I get this guy, some Bosnian guy, and he thinks, "Oh, Bosnians were the first civilization." I'm like, no, dude, no, dude. Or you get the Persian. Like, maybe Third Eye might be honest. Third Eye might lean far more with kind of the bias of Persia. Maybe Persia was more advanced than we ever thought. It's just like nationalism can get in the way, especially
yeah, I
people like
agree.
Robert Sepper. Okay, Robert Sepper is a big YouTuber. He's definitely a white nationalist. I've
Mm,
watched every one of his videos, and I can see it very clearly. And he has a clever way of hiding it, but he's definitely pushing a white nationalist ideology on the origin stories of civilization. And
mhm.
there are things that are contradictory, and yeah, you gotta be careful with certain people like that. I also see that on the African side. A lot of Africans, they want to put the Garden of Eden in all the way in southern Africa, but then they end up using a map. I'll show you a map that was made by a white guy to as
Mhm.
their evidence. I'm like, come on. But
Mhm.
they are, but some of them are rational. Okay, that they definitely aren't just motivated by their nationality, or their culture. There is some logical consistencies that a lot of Ethiopians, especially, really believe that. Yeah, the Gihon has always been associated with the Nile. So you other people just took the name and then put it over in Mesopotamia. But you
See,
put it on a branch of the Tigris River named the Gihon. I'll show a map of that. But let me kind of
yeah.
present. There's basically three locations for the Garden of Eden. Okay,
Uh-huh.
every fitting to the anthropological record, there's no other civilization on the world that would fit this category. So the
Uh-huh.
problem is, if we took the Native American cultures and we say, well, would the Mississippi be categorized as a Garden of Eden? Well,
Uh-huh.
sort of. But the problem is the Mississippi is just too vast. It's too much vegetation. It's not a defined space. And the populations were too scattered. The same thing with China. It has a temperate zone, too many forests, too many trees. There's a lot of rivers. It's more lush, I agree, but it's too big of a garden. So
Uh-huh.
you have to put it in the perspective of those who are telling the story. And the origins of garden history, for example, my book, this book is a textbook called The Gardens. It talks about the origins of gardens. And the first page, when you open up, goes directly to Egypt on
Mhm.
the concept of what a garden is. So when you talk about the word garden, there's this Goldilocks kind of zone you have to think about. either it's too big, like the Indus Valley is a lot larger than Egypt, but its vegetation density is different. It gets water from the glacial melt, water from the Himalayas, and it's more prone to sandy material. And there's silt, but not as dense as what Egypt has. But the problem is its watershed is a lot larger and spreads out, and it's the space is just too large to help consolidate power, geopolitically speaking. So there was Mohenjo-Daro. Mohenjo-Daro had like a city of 30,000 people, but Egypt had like six of those. So there's a big difference there. And the Indus Valley definitely it was the Garden of Eden of Asian culture,
Mm-hmm.
definitely. And it spread towards India, and that's where India's
Mm-hmm.
population exploded. Once it reached that region of India, there's a lot more vegetation, more agriculture could be established. But during the Ice Age, people are fleeing to these three main gardens of Edens. I call them like the holy trinity of gardens. You got the Father is Egypt, the Holy Spirit is the Indus Valley, and the Son is Mesopotamia, because maybe Mesopotamians were born from the Egyptians. That's what I would hypothesize. And the spiritual world, really popped up in India. So I would call them the Holy Spirit would be the Indus Valley. So this is the trinity of the three Goldilocks gardens. The problem
Mm-hmm.
is Indus Valley is too big and the density of vegetation is not as large. The problem with Mesopotamia, it's too sparse. This vegetative map here, this is like a modern map. So when
Mm-hmm.
you're looking at the satellite image, it's showing all the canals and things that people are trying to build to green up the space, and still they can't green it up very well. It's
Mm-hmm.
not as dense, and the rivers are a lot more flat. There's no mountains or a not well defined plateau regions. Whereas Egypt is more of a funnel. It's really well
Mm-hmm.
defined because of the plateaus are raised up. And this is where I think I use Plato as a source for this. I think Plato is
Mm-hmm.
definitely referencing Atlantis to Egypt. He says there are mountains on either side, but not too tall. He actually states something like that. So that could be referring to plateaus. So Egypt has better soil because it gets volcanic pumice from the Ethiopian highlands and the volcanic regions of Mount Kilimanjaro. And over time, that watershed's spreading in there, and they just get a continuous flow of new abundance of silt. And the delta is all the juxtaposition between the desert and the green space is very defined. And the delta was actually even larger during the Ice Age. And people would have fled to this space during the dry Ice Age because it kept getting silt from the volcanic regions, because Central Africa wasn't really affected by the Ice Age.
Mm-hmm.
So it was able to keep flowing. And also the river had a larger flow rate back in ancient times
All right.
compared now because of all the dams. So yeah, I would definitely say we have to narrow it down to three spaces.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And,
and
and
go
and
ahead.
you said the Mesopotamian one uh is too Spartan. Go back up again. What was
It's
it? Too
too sparse.
yeah, too Spartan. Yeah, I'm looking at
So
that like yeah.
because, and this is, they say, Fertile Crescent. Okay, Indus
Uh-huh.
Valley is a lot more fertile than Mesopotamia and Egypt combined. The problem is it's too large. So geopolitically, it's harder to consolidate power. If we say Genesis talking about the establishment of civilization, of a real empire, then Egypt would develop faster than Mesopotamia, than
Mm,
possibly Mesopotamia, because Mesopotamia had multiple kingdoms. They're all walled in cities, but
right.
they were all competing for that extra little green space they could find. But we have to keep in mind that Egypt is categorized to be the largest oasis on the planet,
Wow.
if you don't count the Indus Valley. But again, this is where typology and geopolitics would shape where we would define the Garden of Eden. So when the
Mm-hmm.
Bible says east of Eden, it's really referring to east of the Sahara Desert, the largest desert. And the Hebrews would have known about this massive dune ocean of sand.
Mm-hmm.
So this would have been very obvious to them. So if that, depending on where they're standing, if they were standing in Egypt, they would understand that east. Sometimes they refer to north, because sometimes the directions
Yeah,
did
right.
change depending on the people at the time. So that's where locations get confused because of
Mm-hmm.
translations. But if we
Yeah.
look in the modern context, well, yeah, east of Eden would be the Nile River Valley, that giant green space. And we also have to keep in mind that it was the Egyptians that first also established this idea of a pleasure garden. So in the Hebrew, they reference this idea of paradise. And
Mm-hmm.
paradise is not just referring to agriculture, it's referring to the pleasure of that agricultural space. So that forbidden, seductive fruit, sort of, that, it's not just, surviving on some, some grasslands, but it was actually pleasurable because there was a microclimate there. The temperature, once you get in that garden, it drops like 10 degrees on average.
Right.
Maybe not that much, maybe like 5 to 10, especially in the central delta region. So it had more of a Mediterranean climate.
Mhm.
Whereas once you go outside, you go on that hot sand, temperature just jumps up by 10 degrees or more. So it really was, people wanted to flee to that safe haven. So Eden is referring to deserts. In Hebrew, it refers to wildlands or the uncontrolled space. So when we say Egypt, Egypt is modern Egypt includes the Sahara partially, but back in ancient times, it was just the Nile. That was Egypt. It was the Nile River and the Delta. Even to this day, you could categorize it that. The geopolitical space was that space. Once you cross that, nobody controlled that. You'll die in the desert. Maybe they control a buffer of like 2 or 3 miles,
Mhm.
but not much more because their horses need water. So yeah, Egypt was the first to establish a formal garden designs, and then the Persians and the Mesopotamians adopted that, and they kept to this idea. Eventually, this passes on to the French. The French formal gardens were inspired by Egyptian and Persian gardens, which were inspired by Mesopotamian and Egyptian. So it all kind of leans back in history. So my textbook and my garden history class, they jump straight to Egypt when they talk about the first true pleasure gardens and paradisia. So we also have to keep in mind the land of Kush has always been associated with Ethiopia. It does
Right.
associate sometimes with a region of the mountains of Western Iran and Persia, but that area just wasn't very conducive for the establishment of civilization. So logically, that doesn't make sense to say that's the original land of Kush.
Mhm.
So they said it inhabited the whole area of Kush and Havilah, where it had abundant amounts of gold. So that's where most of the world's gold in the Middle East came from, that Ethiopian region and along the Nile, and then was passed up into Mesopotamia. Of course, there's gold extracts within Anatolia too, but there are mainly two regions where they extracted that. So the river flowed out of Eden, out of the desert regions, and then it branched into four smaller rivers. So the thing is, we didn't realize that the Gihon was a branch of the larger river. We thought these were separate rivers, but they're branching off. The problem is, it does mention Tigris and Euphrates, and that's the issue of cross pollination. As the Jews left Egypt, they started associating to Mesopotamia as the new geopolitical space that they had to deal with.
Okay.
So that's, but again, we showed that Mesopotamia just isn't as lush of a
Mhm.
civilization. It wasn't fully unified. It wasn't as powerful. It didn't have megaliths. It didn't have the right kind of stones, the topology, the type of plants to really make it a true empire until all those little city states. It took dozens of them to
Mhm.
eventually consolidate, and then they were able to build an empire. But a lot of that power that they got from Egypt, where they get
Right.
a lot of their trade from for wheat and beer. It came from Egypt. So once they got all the resources from Egypt, then they were able to kind of establish their civilization and explode into an empire to be able to conquer Egypt again.
Mhm.
Um, Another thing to keep in mind. Oops, I can't see. Oh, something froze. Uh,
I see you scrolling up and down.
okay, well, I can't click. I think my computer froze a little bit. Okay, so there is two ideas of step. So when you conjugate the Garden of Eden as a title phrase, it starts to change its definition. But if you use the word Eden just by itself, it's referring to deserts outside regions that are uncontrolled.
Okay.
It's not referring to the garden. It's the garden in the Eden. But
Mhm.
when you conjugate those together, then you start to associate with the translation of step. And I think Michael Heiser and Yuri Zarins associated this. And this is where Yuri Zarins was getting confused. Okay, well, then do we associate with grasslands? Well, when we think steppe, we think like the steppes of Russia, Ukraine, the
Mhm.
agricultural regions. Well, the Jews didn't know about those regions, maybe some areas in Turkey, but they were referring to the subtropical, warm, temperate steppes.
Okay.
And that was along that ribbon on northern Africa and Mesopotamia, and specifically grasslands, flat grasslands. And that specific grass would have been wheat, the manna. That's what
Mm.
manna really refers to, bread and beer. So the Jews, you got to put in that context. When they say manna and steppe, they're referring to that literal grasslands and the beer and bread that they're getting from those grasslands.
I want to talk to you more about mana because I got some interesting stuff from Jeff Benner about mana, what I put together.
It
We'll
just
talk
means
about that in a
bread.
few.
I think that's all it is.
Oh man, I wish, man, I'm telling you, yeah, we definitely gonna talk. We're gonna have to do this again, and I'm gonna find out where I put it because I actually posted it, a couple of the stuff on there about mana. Yeah, we're gonna definitely have to talk about that. We're gonna definitely talk
Okay, we will get more
about
specific. Yeah.
it.
So
Yeah.
we also have to keep another clue to keep in mind where the Garden of Eden is this idea of the forbidden fruit. The problem is people, this is where Chat GPT is like saying, oh, it's more symbolic. Well, yeah, because in the past 2,000 years, people made it more symbolic. But originally, that symbology was inspired by real poisonous plants. And most of
Hmm.
those plants were living in Egypt, not Mesopotamia. Okay, because
Hmm.
it's more lush of the type of black soil. So when the Bible says Adam was born from the soil, from the clay of the earth, they're referring to Egypt's soil because Egypt's called the
Hmm.
land of Kemet, the black soil, because of the soot and the type of people in Ethiopia, the black people that migrated up into northern
Hmm.
Egypt when they collided with the Anatolian people. So it's referring to kind of both, but mainly to the soil. So
Hmm.
that's where the Bible gives us a clue that, yeah, it's referring to a very lush soil region, and these plants can only grow in those regions. So these are used for medicinal reasons, but also to assassinate people. So the Jews would have known that the Egyptians were using certain types of plants and fruits to poison their rivals for political reasons. So those were like forbidden fruits. Don't use those. You're gonna don't assassinate people with that. And they also were experimenting. The Egyptians were using these medicinal herbs and experimenting them on animals, cats, and things to figure out how can humans use this to benefit humans. So
Hmm.
they were like the first botanists, sort of,
Right.
establishing botanical science, the Egyptians, because they just had so many plants to select from. I mean, not as much as Europe, obviously, but for that region, that was a big deal. Um, and there's also a tradition when we move from poisonous plants to the esoteric adoptions. This phrase of the philosopher's stone is symbolic to the idea of the forbidden fruit. So in the Middle Ages, they were associated to this. So, and specifically when it came to metals, specifically
Hmm.
copper and bronze, and the metals were forbidden fruits because you would turn them into weapons to kill people and gain more geopolitical power. But
Well,
then eventually, in the theological sense, is also associated to the idea of sin, specifically black magic. And the
hmm.
Egyptians were definitely obsessed with magic. They would create these little scroll things, they put them on their doorways. Even the Hebrews did the idea of painting the blood on the door to
Right.
protect
Hmm.
from the angel of death. So that those ideas came from Egypt because they really believed in magic. Because it must have worked to some extent. Maybe 90% of the time it didn't work, but that 20% was enough to motivate a whole civilization to take death very freaking seriously, to the point of burying their little pet dog in a little tube. I mean,
Right.
that's pretty
Right.
insane. So it is associated with the idea, the forbidden fruit is the idea of taking knowledge, too much
Hmm.
knowledge from the gods, specifically angels and demons. That's what we associate in Catholic tradition. We associate angels and demons were the gods of the time. But the
Hmm.
Egyptians couldn't totally distinguish. I mean, they sort of did. Amun Ra, the Aten, is associated with the ultimate God. The sun is
Hmm.
associated to the monotheistic God, but they had this hierarchy that you can't just go to that God. Only the Pharaoh could do that. This
Hmm.
is where the Jews disagreed. The Jews said, no, we can go to the ultimate God, and he came to us now. He didn't go to the pharaohs because of your pride, as Plato references the arrogance and pride of Atlantis. So this could be where, if this is true, we don't know for sure about the Nephilim, but in the future, if it's ever declassified and there's some archaeological records of real bones of mutant humans, then this could indicate that these gods were tampering with humans, possibly. But the reason why Catholics don't focus on that because it just doesn't really help you practically to your day-to-day life. But
Right.
they do acknowledge that there is something weird going on with this idea of the giants. And the question is it some kind of abnormal mutation that was given birth by the magic that Egypt was using? And then women were being giving birth to unusual giants, specifically 7 to 8 feet tall, and they were mutants. I don't know, but there's something to do with that, and that is the idea of black magic. And the Islamic traditions have the same idea too. They call it the legends
Hmm.
of Iram, Saba, and there's another name, I believe. So they also have the same traditions being passed down. So there must be
Right.
something to this. But we'll leave that aside for now. There is this tradition in Egypt about the tree of life, and this is at the Sun Temple of Ra in Heliopolis. And over time, this
Mhm.
association with this tree of life, I mean, there's a lot of symbology on that the Egyptians were adopted because it's a garden culture. Um, and eventually it was associated to the Mary tree, because in Christian tradition now they see Mary is like the new Eve. Eve was like maybe the first dynastic queen of Egypt, I guess, maybe.
Mhm.
Who knows? It could symbolize the first dynastic rulers of Egypt, Adam and Eve. But then they're saying Mary is a more humble ruler, not ruler, but she's God chose a more humbling peasant girl instead of a queen like Nefertiti or whoever. Um, so that tradition has existed in Egypt for a long time, and the idea of this sacred trees, it's a very common motif, and I think that even passed down all the way to the Indus Valley of specifically using the lotus and the fig tree, the Bodhi tree, and that passed eventually into the legends of Agartha and Shambhala. But that probably came from Egypt as migration waves and populations grew.
Right, right.
Of course, there's the idea of the symbolic. In
Mhm.
modern times, the forbidden fruit is basically technology. I mean, we
And
we desire to eat too much of it. We literally are holding a device, an iPhone. It has an apple on it. When you take the mirror image of the apple, you actually see like an alien face looking right back at you. So like the
it's
devil looking right back at you. So it's a lesson about pride and
mhm.
too much adoption of magic and technology combined together.
It,
Um,
it's amazing you say that because have you ever read Anton Parks Eden?
no, I know you mentioned that, but no, I haven't.
Okay, so I already went to the page. It's on page 172, okay? And this is he kind of gives you the tablet identifiers, the so that way you can search the information for yourself. And I really like that because that saves me having to go behind you trying to find the information. You're leading me to the information already, and I can determine if it's a good source or not because of where it came from. But okay, CBS 11065, column 6. He talks about this clay tablet from the Mesopotamians, and he says the artisan Enki revealed the secret of metallurgy to the woman while his sons, the great messenger
Right.
observers, cast metal and cohabited with her, the mother of the human race. The mother knows the secret of the gods, the tool revealed. So when you was talking about metal, that's basically what I get from ancient Mesopotamia, from the Sumerians and stuff. They talk about the idea, or not just the Sumerians, but the ancient Hebrews, when they talk about for agriculture, when they're using plows and hoes and oxes and all kinds of other
Yeah.
ways to start their harvest for their wheat and grain and stuff. Like you was just saying, once they got all their wheat and grain and basically from Egypt, but once they were able to establish their own stuff, they were able to come together as a group of individuals. And like you said, and when you read the Sumerian text, a lot of it, or not just Sumerian text, but the Mesopotamian text, you read about how there's a lot of wars and fighting back and forth, and it makes sense because the area that they were fighting for was for land for agriculture.
That green
Somewhat
space. Now
exactly.
we have to give credit to Gobekli Tepe, but they didn't quite reach that empire space because they just weren't in the right location. The land
Hmm.
really shapes how the geopolitics evolves,
Yeah.
and it's if you're in an area like let's say Iran didn't evolve right away because there's a lot of mountainous valleys that are just simply in the way, and
Hmm.
there's green space within those valleys, but you got to cross these mountains, you got to zigzag around, and the density of the population just wasn't dense enough to establish a civilization right away. So
Hmm.
that's where, and we know architecturally, the style that Persepolis has and Persia has adopted is influenced definitely by the architecture of Egypt and Mesopotamia. And that is architecturally, historians would agree on that. So the space really defines it. So when they say God planted a garden, well, yeah, literally in Africa, there's a giant green oasis sticking
Hmm.
out of Sahara. And that space is what God made, over, billions of years, I guess, or tens of billions. And then mankind flocked to that space during the Younger Dryas and even after, as things dried up again after the African human period. So, yeah, Egypt just best fits this because they reference the idea of the fig tree, and the figs are grown in Egypt a lot more than they are in Mesopotamia. There's fig trees in Israel too, but there's this one YouTuber, he was talking about the Garden of Eden. He was saying it's definitely Africa, it's definitely Egypt. And he's saying, not to be crude here, but he was debating with his fellow African Christians, and he's saying, everybody keeps calling Israel the land of milk and honey. Damn it, Israel's a goddamn desert. And when he's like,
Mhm.
he's really emphasizing to his people that stop looking to Israel as this paradise. It isn't. He says, check the imports and the exports. Okay. You'll see geopolitically, Egypt was far more powerful because of the typology it had. And that's
Mhm.
why Africans are very, very adamant that Ethiopia and Egypt is the origins of the Garden of Eden. And they believe
Yeah.
a lot of it was kind of whitewashed. And I do agree, especially in the 18th century. The maps start shifting. Let's go to this map, for example. In the
Mhm.
14th century, there definitely was a belief that Africa was associated with the Garden of Eden. Now, some uh, black nationalists, they want to say, well, the Garden of Eden is literally in South Africa, where he puts it right here. Well, no, this some white guy made this map. It's an artistic map. It's not meant to be taken too literal because it's pretty close, but it's not detailed enough to take too seriously because they
Mhm.
just didn't explore that area. They
Mhm.
didn't. Most people, whoever this guy is, he didn't go down to Africa to explore it. Okay, he's taking knowledge from sailors as they're mapping
Mhm.
and surveying, and then he's artistically depicting a style for the king or whoever kingdom wanted a map to be made, and they wanted to
So,
be this. So at the time, Prester
mhm.
John, he believed that this idea of Prester John was living in Africa, specifically probably Ethiopia. That's where most Ethiopian Christians would believe that he was probably a king of Ethiopia, and I would agree that there's evidence to that. But the point of this map is to show that there was a belief prior to the 18th century when people became a lot more racist starting around the 18th century, even or before that too, of course. Slavery is something that's been all around for thousands of
Man,
years. Egypt
I'm glad.
resorted to it.
It's funny you say that because my favorite author is Godfrey Higgins. Do you know who that is?
Yeah, I'm not too familiar, but I know the name. I've heard of
Yeah,
him.
Godfrey Higgins, man. He wrote some books in the 1700s, man. He got one called The Celtic Druids, and then he got the Anacalypsis, Volume 1 and 2. Man, these books are so thick, man, and they're so Godfrey Higgins, he studied a lot. I mean, from what I understand, I inspired to be
Is
like
he
him because
African?
no, he's a British. I think he's a British
Oh, he's
white.
British.
Yeah, he's a white guy. He's from Europe, and it's amazing because he talks about how all these the beginning of religion and God started because of black individuals from Africa, basically, in
Yeah,
so many
there
ways.
was some. Yeah, the racial components started because of the what's it called? The Hamitic hypothesis.
Mhm.
This is when this is like I would say maybe 16th centuries when this Hamitic hypothesis was really growing. This belief that there's the line of Cain and the line of
Mhm.
who is it? The other one, our character in the Bible, I forgot. But there was some divergence. And one, the Africans came from this person, and the white people came from that person, and that is what really caused this division.
Mhm.
And we have to blame theologians for that. From those, I don't think. I'm not sure if it was the Catholics or maybe it was I think it was under the Protestant Reformation. Things kind of nationalism
Mhm.
started popping up a lot more in Europe, and that's when that Hamitic hypothesis would be born. And they tried to change the Bible to have more of a racial tone, but before that, around the 14th century, there was this consensus because who was the empire at the time around the 14th century? It was the Ottomans. The Ottomans were the center of the world. That's why
Mhm.
the crosshairs on this map are pointing straight to the center of the Ottoman Empire. Well, it's kind
Mhm.
of a little off center, but
Mhm.
it's basically pointing to the Ottoman Empire near Turkey in the Armenian regions. So the Ottomans shaped geopolitics at the time, and they had this belief. Some Ottomans theologians believe that the Garden of Eden was associated with Africa, and that's why this map maker placed Eden, the reference of Eden, in Africa. It wasn't in Mesopotamia at the time when people in the 14th, 13th century, but over time it shifted as people developed the maps more. So, for example, this map in 1675, this map is a little more detailed. The surveyors are being better at their map making and the cartographers. But what's interesting in this map is if you zoom in on one of the branches of the Nile, as the Bible says, a river went out of Eden and then branched into four heads. Well, that's referring to a delta. and I think Yuri Zarins would agree with me on this, but Yuri Zarins, he's like, well, wait a minute, but the flow of the Tigris Euphrates is going south. So how can that be if they're saying it's flowing out and it's going north? So there's
Hmm.
some confusion that Yuri
Yeah.
Zarins was having. So he's like, okay, let's just place it in northern Iraq. I'm like, but that's not the headwaters. That's not a delta. That's an arid region, and
Right.
the green space on the Tigris Euphrates, it only went out to about like 1 or 2 miles, less than that. So it just wasn't enough space for cultures to really establish a genesis of an empire. But in here, it has the word Python. Python is another derivative for the word the Pishon. And the Pishon and the Gihon to Ethiopians has always been associated to the Nile. But this one guy on the History Channel, he's like, well, we kind of know where the Gihon is, and most Hebrew scholars believe it was the Nile, but that's away from Mesopotamia and the Tigris. So it's the only
Hmm.
things over there is the Egypt. That's like the elephant in the fucking room. Okay. And when you have these paintings in the 14th, 16th century, they're always depicting giraffes, elephants,
Yeah.
lions. And in Europe, you have all these motifs of lions next to government buildings
Hmm.
because they
Yeah.
got their culture from Egypt. They got their
Yeah. And then,
knowledge.
yeah. Hmm.
So Egypt is the origin. It's the garden that gave birth to Western civilization and Eastern civilization. Now, of course, we do have to get credit to Mesopotamians. They may have been first, but they weren't able to consolidate the power. So a lot of them probably fled to Egypt and became governors of Egypt. So some of them may have went to Egypt and say, maybe this city state in Mesopotamia, the city of Mari, for example, in Syria, maybe I want to move down to Egypt where it's greener and I can get a better job down there as a governor. So, and then they just asked permission from the pharaoh's governorships at the time. So yeah, people gave a lot of homage to Egypt, and this map shows that there was a time in the 16th century that people believed that the Python was associated with a branch off the canal of the pharaohs, the biggest canal that the Egyptians had made that connects back down to the Red Sea. That's a big geopolitical space in the sense that that river was a highway to getting out of the garden into Israel. People took boats there and then they went on the camel routes up to Israel. Or some went up following the Mediterranean. Most of them actually just followed the Mediterranean coastline. Then they went up to Syria. Then they went back down. Once they got to Syria, that's when they try to connect the tributaries that connect back to the Tigris Euphrates, and then they went down as the water flows down. So, so the space can really tell us, the landscape can really tell us how migration waves were moving majority of the time, just as shipping routes can tell us today. And this map also shows, that Cairo was also called Babylon. People can't forget that, but people ignore that because that's a 16th century map. Well, why did
Yeah.
they name it that? Well, we also have to consider that apparently in this map, for example, they also named the Gihon in the Mesopotamia region, but also the Pihon in Egypt, and then Babylon in Cairo, but also Babylon in Mesopotamia. So they're using the same place names and moving them because they're taking inspiration from an original source. The question is, what's that original source? And I think this map here gives an artistic kind of symbolic depiction. Adam was the first man, I guess you could say, symbolizing hunter and gatherers, I guess. And let's say he was in Göbekli Tepe. So they put this depiction up here in the region of Turkey, kind of that area. Not quite precise, obviously. But then when Adam married into different tribes, I guess, and new Eves were being married into each other with the different Adams, and then they started consolidating their tribes, and then they moved down, and then they found a garden. They found that garden. They're like, oh shit, this is a beautiful space. It's flat. I don't have to walk up mountains to get to the next valley for gardening. It's a very well defined space that has a motif of a snake. The Nile literally is in the shape of a snake, specifically a cobra. And the word python is a derivative word python.
Mm.
You forget that. So
Yeah.
that snake motif is a very powerful crown symbol of Egypt.
Hmm.
And every culture adopted that because Egypt was probably the first to truly adopt it because snakes were associated with water and plants, specifically climbing up trees. So maybe not cobras, but the cobra was the main symbol. Pythons were more southern Egypt, near Ethiopia, which Ethiopia was once referred to by the Romans and the Greeks as Atlantia. So that's kind of interesting. So basically, this map can say, okay, Adam and Eve established their dynasty in Egypt. The flood happened. And this is where I think the Great Flood was a real event. And it might have happened on the Nile. Some unusual monsoons may have happened in Ethiopian highlands. It flooded the area, as the Islamic text of the city of Iram and Saba says, that the dams broke and mass flooding happened in the garden, and then they were forced to leave. And they left, then they established themselves back in Mesopotamia, and they were scattered all over the Middle East, basically, after the flood. And then other city states are popping up everywhere. So that's kind of how you should look at this. And so kind of going now into the timeline scenario is this is where I don't agree with Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson anymore on the Younger Dryas. Something doesn't logically make sense here because the Younger Dryas is over here, but they kind of ignore the Bowling Alloy period. Like, what caused this sharp warm up? So some scholars believe that, or geologists believe that this is probably some kind of eccentricity, the rotation of the Earth, its position with the sun at the time, that caused a sharp warm up, but something caused a cooling event way before the Younger Dryas. But this is a period of like 3,000 years. Okay, most asteroids will not cause a cooling for 3,000 years. Not even the KT extinction did that. The KT extinction of the dinosaurs, it was like maybe a couple hundred years, most would believe. But then it kind of, it faded back down. The clouds and rain fell down, and everything kind of went back to normal. But this happened over a period of 3,000 years, which indicates to geologists that this is probably just some kind of natural oscillation with the Earth in juxtaposition with the sun and on its eccentricity orbit. But then it got back out of that, and then the whole scene was started. But during the Younger Dryas, it was very cold, and water was locked up, which means things were more arid, which would force people to go into the Garden of Eden even more, especially people from Anatolia and southern Central Africa, Ethiopia regions. They would have stayed in that space because that was the safe haven. If they go out there, it's too cold, it's too dry, and they can't survive until the African human period. People scattered away from the garden and then probably came back as the African human period retreated. But the African human period is really just a blip right about here. So I can see why people are so fixated on the Younger Dryas, but they're kind of ignoring that the Younger Dryas really started in the Bowling Alloy. That's when that cooling event happened over a period of 3,000 years. So that's not probably an asteroid. Okay, so they did kill off the mammoths. I agree. This event, is sharply warmed up. This was probably supposed to be the beginning of the Holocene. Something caused that oscillation. Now, I don't know if there's we don't know if the Earth's eccentricity is totally consistent. Maybe there are some wobbly things associated with the moon. We don't know. So I'm not an astrophysicist to figure that out. But this is not a signature of probably an asteroid causing this, or even volcano. Most of these little blips here, a lot of those little blips are either small oscillations of the Earth, like the Pioneal oscillation, which caused unusual monsoon events during the African human period, and volcanoes and asteroids. So most asteroids the size of size of a skyscraper, they would make these blips, these small blips. They wouldn't make these big blips. Rarely, unless it's the size of 10 miles in diameter. Okay, then maybe. So possibly, but even if an asteroid caused this blip, this drop in the cooling around the Bowling Alloy, you still have this major cold spell here. And all the temperate regions of North America and Europe and Russia were locked up with cold ice and glaciers, but also just permafrost. And it just wasn't conducive for agriculture at that time. So there's not enough space here. So everybody during this period were staying in the garden. They were staying in Indus Valley. They were staying in Mesopotamia and Egypt. And they were kind of locked in there because if they go south, there's too much desert and it's too tropical, and the landmass is too massive that people can't consolidate power as easily. But these spaces, these three main gardens, they started to breed civilization, but they needed time. So once this warm spell happened, you have this period of time right here, about maybe 6,000 to 8,000 years, and that gives them enough time for populations to increase, agriculture to start to be discovered and pop up. So it just makes sense that this fits with the biblical record, that the Bible, they say, the story of Genesis is around 6,000, 5,000 BC. Well, that fits anthropologically with the birth of civilization. It's just the most logical conclusion.
Agriculture. It really seems like agriculture is the birth of the civilization. I know that's why I asked earlier, what is your what is your idea, your criteria of a civilization?
Oh, well, yeah, I would say agriculture came first, but it there's stages in development of civilization, but you really have to have these round city states.
Mhm.
And Plato alludes to that. Plato says,
Yeah.
Atlantis was a round city state. And guess what? The ancient city of Mari, which is around 3000 BC, it was round. Jericho was oval shaped. And then the Egyptian cities were more rectangular and square, but they were all walled in cities because there was
Hmm.
marauders and things and they wanted control. And
Hmm.
then the palaces and the gardens were inside those temple complexes,
Hmm.
the actual pleasure gardens of the pharaohs. So yeah, it makes sense that you need establishment of a city and a temple, a king, and consolidation of a geopolitical power. And that's when you have a true civilization. You have to have bureaucracies, you have to have scribes, you have to have priests, you have to have architects like Imhotep, and you got to have farmers, and all those are working for a purpose. So
Yeah.
during the wet season of Egypt, people were like, I have nothing to do because it's all kind of flooded right now. I got to wait till it dries up to plant anything. Well, that's when the pharaohs gave them some national task to do, and that was to build the pyramids, the towers of Babel. Those
Mm.
were the pyramids. So I don't think it was a mud brick ziggurat. Architecturally, that's puny compared to what Egypt made. So I think the real towers of Babel were definitely, there's more than one. They just simplified. See, these stories are simplified for children to
Yes.
understand. They're
Yes,
not
they
gonna
are.
see in Sunday school with a 10-year-old. A priest is not gonna go to teach about, oh yeah, the gods came down, they genetically fucked with humans, and they built Nephilim with 6 fingers, 6 toes, and then they raped and enslaved and cannibalized humans and established slavery. And they're not going to talk about stuff like that because it's pretty disturbing. And then it
It
connects
is.
with the Nazis and the Aryan race and the Atlanteans. No, they're not going to teach that stuff in Sunday school. But in college, there is some allusion, reference to like, okay, there's something associated with the Hermetic hypothesis, the
Mhm.
Aryan race, the Atlanteans. There's a connection with the Bible here with the Nephilim, and that's when you start to piece together the puzzle. But you gotta be careful because I can understand why the CIA would be concerned because people will take those stories to spread. Oh, look, there truly was an Aryan super race, and we came from them. But what are the Native Americans saying? The Native Americans said those giants were evil. They were cannibals. They would see themselves as superior. And why would you want to be associated with these 8 foot tall giants? But people have the desire to eat from this forbidden fruit. We're doing it to this very day in the
Mhm.
sense of like trying to summon UFOs. I've done it
Mhm.
once, never doing it again. And trying to gain some kind of knowledge and power. And oh, the guy can talk with the gods. You don't want to fuck with the gods. Just
Mhm.
leave them alone. Let the big God keep them under control. But if you open yourself up, if you're a portal, because that's what the human body is, it's a
Mhm.
portal to connecting with the gods. And it
It's
can
a
be as simple
vessel.
as going outside, because in the ancient times in Cahokia, for example, in St. Louis here, they built these mound pyramids to as summoning platforms for the gods.
Yeah.
The shamans would go up there and start doing their chants like, oh la
Yeah.
la, give me
Meditation and do all
all that
the
stuff, but they
traditional
don't know
stuff.
what
Yeah.
they're necessarily summoning. It could be some demonic force that fucks with them for the rest of their whole civilization, and it breaks their civilization up. It causes human sacrifice, and
Mhm.
that was the evil temptation. Human sacrifice was everywhere. It's
Visions are
disturbing when I read.
powerful, man.
That's why I hated anthropology, because every time I read the anthropology book when I took some classes, I'm like, oh great, more human sacrifice. Oh look, China did it, Egypt did it. Why are they all doing this? Because these gods,
The
when
visions
Adam and
that they
Eve,
have.
yeah, they were, well, no, I think these gods were very real in the sense that they manifested as these orbs of light, what we
No,
call
that's what
UAPs.
I'm saying.
Yeah.
Visions are powerful. You don't just see with your ears. I mean, with your eyes. You don't see with just with your eyes. You don't see with just your. You don't hear things with just your ears. Some people can hear things and picture it in their eyes. Inside their
Well,
internally in their mind. So it's
no, I definitely would disagree. I would say that Michael S. Heiser said that this idea of communing with the gods, it was an external effect. This wasn't just something in your mind,
no, 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 no.
levitating. This was
No. I'm
summoning
not
real
saying that.
things.
No, I'm not saying that because when you read Ezekiel, when he talks about
Yeah.
the chariot, you know, these things come into play later on in life. A lot of these inventors, like Nikola Tesla, for example, he visualized a lot of these inventions, a lot of this stuff that he had that he invented, that he had it in his mind first. You know, this was something he tapped into that nobody else or other people
Well,
could hardly
that could
do.
be
So
like your guardian angel giving you some knowledge. That's perfectly fine. When people have these intuitions, those intuitions can be caused by angels that just because angels are basically electromagnetic in their nature. They're pure
mhm.
spirits. So they can get into the mind slightly and tweak it to give you a little bit of knowledge. But if you're actively making rituals
Yeah.
and murdering
Mm.
babies, throwing
Yeah,
off
now
a
that's yeah,
pyramid, that's demonic. And
yeah,
that's
yeah.
when they're trying to these gods, the rulers were trying to become a literal god, and Egypt was
Hmm.
obsessed with that. They're trying
Yep.
to figure out, how do we preserve the body, how do we resurrect it, can we actually tamper with idea of medicinal herbs, psychedelics, all that stuff, to figure out how to summon these gods and give us power, give us rain, or whatever. And this is where Dr. David Miano, he's like, he doesn't believe this because he's more atheistic, but this is, the Egyptians were obsessed with this. The question is
Yeah.
why. Well, there
Yeah.
must have been real supernatural phenomenons, external events that caused this belief. And
Yeah, I
that's
mean,
what
it
seems
was
to
those
happen.
hallucinogens. It was those hallucinogens. They got that's why, you know, when you read the ancient texts, when you read about these, you know, the trying to connect with, you know, who whatever you want to call them, UFOs, UAPs, aliens, gods, demons, or whatever you want to call them, it always seems like they have some kind of really deep intent of taking some type of hallucinogen. At least in the ancient times, you know, today
That could be a
people,
connection with the forbidden fruit idea.
yeah,
There's
well,
a, it's not a literal fruit, but
yeah,
it could be some kind of drug, a poppy
because you
plant.
talked about the third eye earlier, right?
Did I talk to Third Eye?
Yeah. No, I said you talked about the third eye earlier, right? About
Oh
like
no. Oh yo, the Third Eye is, yeah, it's kind, no, I didn't mention. I mean, the all-seeing eye is a reference to God, the Holy
mhm,
Trinity. That's how I believe it. I mean, you can actually see this in the Kremlin. They have the all-seeing eye right up there, and people think it's Illuminati, but it's a symbol of God. That's all
mhm,
it is. The thing is, in ancient times, the Eye of Ra, it is sort of associated with a lower god. It's like there's the Eye of Ra, but then there's the
mhm,
Aten and the
mhm,
Amun, and it refers to the hidden one. So there's a
right.
confusion on how you categorize these gods, because in ancient times it was very hard to distinguish what was a good god, what was a bad god, and which one, because they're all pure spirits, but they can take very material form. And that's what we're
Yeah.
learning with this whole
The
UAP
Book of Enoch kind of
disclosure.
explains that.
Yeah, I think when they talk about the wheels again, wheels within wheels in the Ezekiel, that is some kind of poetic description describing probably these orbs of light. And the
Hmm.
Thule papyrus is maybe another example. The
I
Egyptians
never thought about that.
documented that. It's probably a description of these literal light beings. Then when they say Lucifer was an angel of light, well, yeah,
Mhm.
okay, but they're using snake motif to describe these gods because they move like a serpent, sort of in the air. But that's where they
Mm.
put the depiction of wings, Horus, with a connection with
Yeah, because wings
Apophos,
means
the
fly.
snake.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's all artistic depictions. We shouldn't take them too literal, because the
Yeah,
original depiction is a ball of light. So in Islam, they call them jinns,
yeah.
these fiery, smokeless beings. In
Mm.
Japan, they call them yokais. And the original artistic depiction is this ball of light.
Yeah.
In the Celtic tradition,
Yeah.
it's willow of the wisp or fairies. It's a ball of light. The author said it's a ball of light because that's the tradition and observation people have seen in England for literally hundreds of years.
Mm.
So, and many saints would also agree with that, that angels have this kind of manifestation, that they are more than just spirits. They can be very material, but within limited time and space. And that's what we call the ancient Egyptian gods, are what we now call angels and demons, or jinns and yokais.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
getting to the last slide here. So this is where I
Ooh.
asked ChatGPT. So the AI can reveal a lot of things that are more rational, and we shouldn't get too caught up with over symbolic ideas. So if I think Jesus would probably state this quote too. So, do you seek the mythical land that dwells beneath the restless waves of your original sin? That mythical land is Atlantis, that people are obsessed with. But we have to fit it to the context of Plato's worldview. And Plato is a source for Genesis, but he's
Mhm.
an external source. But people don't associate Plato with Genesis. They want to separate. Well, Plato didn't mention the word Eden. Well, because he didn't speak Hebrew or Aramaic.
Mm,
Okay, so he spoke Greek.
mm,
He knew some Egyptian, and he got a lot of things confused. But he was pretty adamant that at one time when we asked ChatGPT, okay, I can't get I gotta scroll a little bit because this is in the way. I asked, first, where's the historical Garden of Eden? And basically, ChatGPT summarized three main places. So, of course, it says it's up for debate and all that, but basically, it says Mesopotamia, Indus
mhm,
Valley, and Egypt.
mhm.
So I think that's pretty revolutionary. And then it has to acknowledge, oh, some people believe it's in America, some people believe it's a whole damn planet. Okay, sure. In the perspective of God's avatar, Jesus, I guess you could say that the whole damn planet is our garden amongst the Eden of outer space. Sure, we can broaden it that way. But if we're talking about some political narrative and theological narrative that a specific group of people were believing in, they were associated to the politics of their time and the religion of their time. And they were associated to the geopolitical space that was influencing their culture, determining whether they get grain or they don't get grain, or they get money or they don't get money from the pharaohs, the taxation and all that. So this space that looks like a snake coming out of the Eden, the darkness of the Sahara, that's the Garden of Eden. That's the delta and the ribbon of the snake. And the head, the pharaohs understood this. The pharaohs realized that they're living in a space that literally looks like a snake. Of course, there is some depiction with the idea of the lotus flower too. There is a motif of the snake and the lotus, depending on which ruler at the time. But some believe that the Fayum Oasis was a canal that the pharaohs built, and they were trying to create a motif of a lotus, but they
Mhm.
never completed the left side of the growth sprouts from the lotus on the left side. They got to, I'm sorry, on the right side. So you see that white space there, the lights, the cities.
Yep.
People think
Mhm.
Atlantis is, you can't find Atlantis. Well, I think it's hidden in plain sight, as Jimmy from Bright Insight states. But the problem is Jimmy just can't fathom that it's literally hiding in plain sight. Atlantis. When I read ChatGPT here, I ask the question: the Mediterranean Sea is known as the Middle Sea, but was it also once referred to as the Atlantic Sea in ancient times? And it said yes. In ancient times, the Mediterranean Sea was sometimes referred to as the Atlantic Sea, particularly by the Greeks, and that was the Sticherus, I think, a poet from, I think it was Athens. And then the Romans also associated this. This was because the Mediterranean was seen as a continuation of the Atlantic Ocean. There was no distinction really until the Phoenicians explored outside the modern day Pillars of Hercules. Then they distinguished two different words for the word ocean and sea. But in ancient times, not during Plato, but during time of Solon, they
Yeah.
associated it was the same
I'm
thing.
glad you said so long, because a lot of people don't even know that that's where the story of
Yeah.
Atlantis actually comes from.
And Plato references many things that sound just like Genesis in some sense. There's a plain, there's a garden, there are gods, there are temples, and there's plateaus, small mountains on either side of the garden, a linear plain, oblong shape. Everything Plato says, elephants, certain types of plants he mentions. So it all fits to Egypt, because in his time, Plato had visited Egypt, Solon had visited Egypt, Aristotle, almost all the Greeks got their knowledge from Egypt.
Egypt,
So
yep.
they're giving so much homage, but Plato's kind of twisting the story slightly to
Mhm.
reapply this Atlantean legend that was inspired from all the characteristics of Egypt, and putting that onto Persia, because that was the geopolitical empire at the time. So
Mhm.
that was the same thing. But in the perspective of the Hebrews, the geopolitical empire was Egypt. And they were like fighting against Egypt. They wanted more autonomy, all the geopolitical issues that come with that. So AI can reveal a lot to us if we ask the right questions. It can
Right.
reveal us to what Jesus really looked like. Jesus wasn't black, and he wasn't Norwegian white, okay? And he wasn't an Eskimo. He was looking like an ancient Semitic Hebrew Egyptian.
Mhm.
That's what he probably looked like. This is what anthropologists would probably agree on. This is what people looked like back in those days. They're a mixture of white and black, Semitic. And
You know
so,
what? I'm glad you said that. Okay, because I'm about to put you on something. I'm actually African American and German and Turkish. So
German, really. My
yeah, so
sister,
when
she's Indian, but she has 20% Italian. I'm like, you don't look Italian, but it's
but I
like,
say
yeah,
that
that's
I say that
nowadays with
because you
globalism,
said
yeah, it's
because you said Jesus wasn't black, right? That I just want to
Yeah, I
make
don't agree with the
yeah.
Black Hebrew
Okay,
Israelites on
so
that.
I grew up down south Georgia, in Georgia. Right now I'm in Georgia. You see how my
Yeah,
hair is. Look.
you can have straight hair, somewhat
Now look.
curly and straight.
Yeah, you see how my hair is, right? So
Yeah.
when I was growing up, because I'm African American and German and Turkish, I also have like Egyptian in me, but it's a low percentage, and I also have like Japanese in me. But I grew up
Japanese, how'd
being
that happen?
I don't know, but I was told that I was black. When people look at me, they consider me black. I mean, I was a little kid and I got called the N-word when I was a little kid, and I had hair. My hair never changed. I mean, it was shorter, of course, especially in the military. And there's pictures of that, but for the most part, my this is the first time my hair has ever been this long in my life. So
Hmm.
I was considered black. Like my skin, like my dad he's not like dark skin, but he is dark skin. And my mom, she looks like a she's not light skin like really light like white Caucasian. She has a little tan to her because she has
Hmm.
Turkish in her. But I was told I'm black, and I always hear because you always hear it to yourself that the ancient Egyptians weren't black. They weren't black, and you said that the
They were
Semitic.
at some periods. The
Yeah,
problem is
right.
Egypt's 3000 BC plus.
Right. But what I'm
So it's
saying is that when it comes
multiple.
to the Semitic people, I always wonder how dark could they have been because I'm actually, like I said, I'm 44% like Nigerian, and I have some other uh, uh, African
Hmm.
ancestry in me, and then I have like I don't even know. Like it's a really small. It's like my mom's German and Turkish, so I can't remember the numbers for those two. But the only reason why I remember 44% because this is just an easy number to remember, I guess. But I'm telling you, I'm considered black. Like I was like
Hmm.
when I would put on my
Well,
paperwork when I go
in
to school.
general, yeah. I would, if I were to objectively look at you, I would say you're African
Right, right,
American.
right,
Yeah. But
right.
your eyes, if you look closely, some people have like some have more like Asian eyes, but the rest of
Hmm.
them kind of look white. It's like, oh,
Yeah,
well, that's where like some parts of like your inheritance, you get a little inheritance in your eyes,
from
maybe a little
everywhere.
inheritance
Yep.
in your penis. I
Yeah,
don't know.
because I was told I was
Like
told that I have a
it,
Turkish nose.
it's a
I mean,
mix nowadays.
there's a dude that lives right down the street from my mom's house. He's fully Turkish, and he, my when he seen me when I was a little kid and stuff, he used to always tell my mom, "You can tell that boy's Turkish because of my nose." That's what they would say. So you're right.
Hmm.
When you look at people, you can see different characteristics from different places, and that's why I asked about the black thing, and that's part of the reason why I brought up. The SLC 2485, the basically what it's called is the white gene. I guess that's what you can call it because it tells you around 6 to 10,000 years ago. That's when people came from a darker complexion because I'm pretty dark, just being mixed, and I get really light. Like I almost get almost just a little shade darker than you during the winter time.
Hmm.
But in the summertime, man, I get really dark. And so, you know,
Yeah,
I
it's my
found out
sister.
that.
She's brown. She tans. I can see it. It's
Mm.
she's like, oh no, I'm turning dark, and she wants to be lighter. I'm like,
And I can, and I'm
which
telling you,
one
it's
look?
amazing because I really wanted to know how did we get different skin tones? We was
We
typically
probably
told
fuck with
that.
Neanderthals. That's
and
probably what
and
happened.
and I had that conversation with Dr. Keith Chang. He actually explained it to me. He actually explained it to me one on one. I'm going to launch it sometime in the future. I'm trying to get him on another one with basic genetics because I really try to talk to people who are experts on this. I don't have a college degree, so I rely on the people who are experts,
Yeah,
and then I share what they've learned. That's why I read so many different books from different places. But I also wanted you to know that when you pick those three places, when you picked Ethiopia or Egypt,
Atlantia. Yeah,
and
and
yeah,
Egypt.
for those places, I want you to understand something. When I talked about haplogroups earlier, haplogroup E1b1b is the last haplogroup to leave the Horn of Africa, and that was around 26,000 years ago. And they dispersed themselves throughout Europe and Mesopotamia, and they can also find some of that haplogroup into the Indus Valley with the people over there.
Mm.
Now, this is how I understand haplogroups. A lot of people tell me, because I tell them, hey, this is how you find out about haplogroups. I'll tell people you can't necessarily go to a grave site, dig somebody's bones up and get their haplogroup, their genetic makeup. You can probably get some if it's available, if they have some kind of, enough material there for you to do it. What you can do is get the genetic material of the people that live there today. And what I mean by that is the people that live in Iraq today, you get enough blood samples, genetic makeup of those people in Iraq, those people who lived there for generations and generations, you can determine what their haplogroups are. And when you determine what their haplogroups are, you can determine which one of those haplogroups are the oldest. Like just in my case, I'm a mixture of a lot of different I guess you could say different people from around the world. I have, like I said, I have Japanese in me. I have Nigerian in me, and I have Turkish, Italian and stuff like that. So I have all these different things in there. But what is the oldest haplogroup out of all those? Out of all those genetic makeups, and that's when you
from Africa,
and you can see where these people came from, and you can see how they dispersed and stuff. And that's how I use the what you call it. That's how I try to find the similarities between the mythologies and the traditional oral stories. So like if somebody says, well, the Mesoamericans had a traditional oral story, the Native Americans, and it lines up with the ancient Egyptians. Well, then I look up the Mesoamerican haplogroup and the ancient Egyptian haplogroup, see when was the haplogroup that possibly is the common link between them. You see, I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's one they found in Peru, which is interesting. They detected a new on the Paracas skulls. They actually had scientifically tested. Gaia.com actually spent millions of dollars getting the DNA testing, and they found out there's some unusual genetic connection with people in Turkey. Like, how did people? They had some haplogroup was connected with the Paracas skulls, and those skulls are like 2,000 years old.
So you know what I'm talking about with the haplogroups,
yeah. So the thing is, like, you could say that civilization came out of Egypt around, I would say, 70,000 years ago. That's where modern Homo sapiens came out. Now, there were Homo sapiens that came out before, but during the Toba eruption, most of Asia was under a volcanic winter. And that killed off a lot of people. So it created possibly a bottleneck in that region, but not in Africa. Africa wasn't totally affected. So that's why. So as those humans, Homo sapiens, but then the Homo sapiens came out, they may have mixed with, the Neanderthals that were trying to stay in Turkey. So a lot of Neanderthals, even they were staying at the low latitudes around the Mediterranean because it was ice age up there. They they lived in the mountain regions. They're more like cavemen. But people get horny, so they'll have sex, and then that's where the divergence of Africans and Caucasians start to happen. People forget though that there are Caucasian type people that are in Africa, but they're black. So in the type of phenotypes of their eyes, specifically the Habesha people of Ethiopia. So this is where they say India. There are like two main African races. So they're saying there's Africans and then there's people in India. The thing is, when did the population of India really explode? And they're thinking, exploded around 2,000 years ago. But prior to that, they believe they came from Africa, but they didn't look necessarily like, let's say, Nigerian African.
Yeah.
They actually had Caucasian features, but they were born in Africa, not from Europe. But then they went out, and majority of them stayed trapped within India because of the type of geopolitical space they had. It was just conducive to stay in that space. And then they kept intermixing, marrying your brother and your sister and all that. And then they started to become more homogeneous. But and they get trapped in that space.
Isn't the word itself derived from the Caucasus Mountain though?
Yeah, but that's a later interpretation.
Yeah, and that's where I'm.
Africans that have blue eyes in Ethiopia. It's very rare.
That's what I said that. That's
it's where.
That's why I talked about SLC 2485. That goes.
See, there are some in Africa. Yeah, it's very rare, but that's the connection for that albino kind of mixture. There are albino Africans.
That's because of that gene. That's because of that gene. That's that gene that I'm talking about. SL2485.
That's the albino gene.
Albinism is different because he talks about that too, but it kind of falls all under that same category. Like that gene is what causes it's a lack of I can't remember exactly what he says.
Melanin.
Well, he does talk about that, yes, of course, but
for example, let's say America survives for another 2,000 years. Okay, would the people in the future 2,000 years still be considered white European?
Yeah, exactly.
No, because I see redneck Americans. They're like living in the South, and they're like, "Fuck Europe," we don't fuck Ukraine, fuck we don't need their problems. I'm not European. I'm American.
Yeah, but that's what I'm
Your
saying.
nationality starts to shift. But what's interesting there in California, there's a genetic change sort of happening of a lot of white people. They're starting to get darker. And the reason is because of the climate's there. A lot of women, I mean, not just going to tanning booths are increasing the process. Also, those that survive the cancer and their kids survive, then they start to become tanner. So
Mm,
people like the California girls, kind of idea, they tend to be tanner than girls in like Virginia or in New
mm-hmm.
York, obviously,
Yep.
because they've been there for about 100 years. Their lineage, like a lot of their families stay there, so they start to become more and more tan, which is kind of
But
interesting. So that's in
now,
less than 100 years.
now you know what?
I
I'm
mean,
gonna talk to when I talk to Dr. Keith Chang, I'm
but
gonna
that's a
send him an
hybridization
email.
too.
I'm gonna ask Dr. Keith Chang this because this sparks my interest. Okay, so when you go tanning, that light is supposed to mimic the sun. Okay,
Yeah.
that SLC2485 gene that I'm talking about happened because somebody left Africa and went to Europe, had some kind of gene mutation because of wherever they lived at, and when they had offspring, that offspring, their offspring actually activated that gene
Yeah, the type of
SL2485.
solar
Yeah,
the type of solar bombardment that happens on the skin might start to, they might have got certain types of cancers, but the kids that survive that, the next generation, they
it might
start to change.
activate
It
another
might be a
genetic
lot faster than we
mutation.
think. That
Yeah,
evolutionary change might be a lot faster. But there is a consistency that, yeah, a lot of people in Asia, like China, they look like Han Chinese, and a lot of people in India
mm-hmm.
look like India because, yes, they've been there for about a long time, at least
Mm-hmm.
2000 BC. But around 4000 BC, that's when things kind of start shifting. Because you got to remember, the populations were small. The
Mm-hmm.
whole world during the Younger Dryas of the human population was probably less than 10 million, or I think 5 million,
Less than that.
less than that possibly. And they were
Yeah.
scattered over the whole planet. But the
Mm-hmm.
densest population region was in Egypt, Indus Valley, and Mesopotamia, and
Mm-hmm.
Turkey possibly as well. But those were the three main densest regions
Well, Turkey
because
is
of the
considered
geography.
Mesopotamian.
Uh, the
To some
topography
people,
is quite a bit different because of the
yeah,
hilly nature.
yeah.
It's not flat
Mm-hmm.
like Mesopotamia, because Mesopotamia refers to between the two
The two
rivers,
rivers, yeah.
and that's where that people are trying to connect those two rivers and green up that space. But the density, the typology was different because of the type of silt. They
Mm-hmm.
don't get they get runoff from the mountain region, the Rocky Mountain regions and plateaus of Turkey and Armenia, whereas Egypt gets pumice from
Mm-hmm.
Africa, and that really changes the type of the type of soil they have. Whereas in Mesopotamia, they didn't really form a good delta. If you look at
Mm-hmm.
Mesopotamia, it doesn't have a good delta, surprisingly,
Mm-hmm.
because of the type of soil.
I
They
always
don't.
tell
They're
people to
lacking
go
that.
ahead and go on Google Earth. I say, man, you can look at so many stuff on Google Earth. You can literally drive
Yeah,
down the road on Google Earth and just see
you
things.
can
And
literally find Atlantis and Eden. You just got to
yeah,
think about it. So like that's why I think I just find this interesting. That, like if you use ChatGPT in the right way, it can produce an AI that really is pretty precise to what Jesus may have looked like and where Atlantis and Garvin is. But the AI doesn't know for sure. You
that's
still
a
have to gain that knowledge and feed it the right questions, and then it starts to refine itself. But it's not trying to give you confirmation bias necessarily. It's still saying, well, obviously it's up for debate because there's no consensus
mm-hmm.
document from coming from Harvard saying this is the Garden of Eden. Okay, that's the
Yeah.
problem. It's trying to gather that data. But if you use your common sense and logic and don't use your nationalism, you can find, these places. It's not doesn't have to be a mystery. The problem is politics and theological politics gets in the way of nationality, and that's why it's hidden. And they
Yeah.
say God will reveal it. Well, God works through other people like me, Ralph Ellis, Michael S. Heiser, you, and over time, collectively, we can solve this mystery, and that's what we call the revelations. The
Mm,
veil is lifting, sort of
mm,
slowly as knowledge is being gained. It can be dangerous
right.
too. It can be dangerous because the last thing we need is the Chinese or the CIA trying to clone the Nephilim back to life and creating a super race of 6-fingered, 8-foot giants with blonde hair. I mean, maybe that's a good thing that they're wiped out because Native Americans said that they weren't very friendly. They were cannibals. So maybe it's a good thing that we don't want to associate with these Nephilim Aryan giants because I feel like so many people are obsessed with that, but that's like the forbidden fruit. You're literally eating from the forbidden fruit. Robert Sepper and YouTubers like A History of, he's another kind of white nationalist, I would say, but he's promoting Tartaria stuff. And who promotes Tartaria stuff? It's not black people, it's not Chinese people, it's always white people, and they're trying to promote this lost civilization, this Greek Roman architecture, but you gotta look at things
It's where
back
that.
in the past and sort out and realize that there is original source. There is
Yeah.
original tree of life, a seed that started, and that is those three gardens, those three seas, Indus Valley, Egypt, and Mesopotamia.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I mean, what you said was basically what I've read, and I've read all of those three theories. I mean, in detail, just like you said it, because there's so many different books out there. I have all of Plato's books. I think he has 30 books. I have all his works. And I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna really dig deep into them, and I'm going to try to put everything that he wrote about, on my website, because it's interesting. A lot of people, like I was talking to this one guy, he was talking about Atlantis, and I was like, "Oh, what's your favorite book of that Plato wrote about in Atlantis?" And he was like, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Like I guess I'm gonna say it right, Timaeus. I think that's how you say it."
yeah, Timaeus, yeah,
Yeah, I asked him about that book. He was like, "What are you talking about?" I said, "You don't know anything about that? That's the one where he talks a little bit about Atlantis," and he had no idea. And I was just
yeah.
like, man, it's just amazing that,
And Plato's
people.
getting a lot of things from Herodotus' travels in Egypt
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Solon as well. So he's taken a compilation of things, but
Hmm.
he Plato is also fitting his story to some kind of political message because Plato at the time is kind of like the Wall Street Journal at the time, sort of like they're trying to make a political narrative.
Yeah.
Same with the Hebrew text in Genesis. There's a political message like, oh, the bad Egyptians, oh, the bad
Yeah.
Mesopotamians, they're all bad against us because
You gotta dismiss all that and actually read what it's trying to say. You know what I mean? Like you're right, because when I grew up Catholic too, and my mom, my grandma, my Uma, she was German, and she said that I couldn't leave, the house until I got baptized. So religion was a major thing in my family. But as I got older and became exposed to other people, because I went to public schools, of course, I learned about Islam because I had people in my class who were Muslims, and then the same thing with Hinduism and so on and so forth. And I was always wondering and curious about who are these gods, who are these gods and goddesses, and then I would read the Bible. I've read the Bible so many different times. Just in the last 2 months, I read 5 different versions of the ancient Hebrew text, including the mechanical translation along with the
that's why they call it the
mechanical translation.
super book.
Yeah, so it's reading that stuff. You learn so many different things and get an idea of so many different things from different people. And that's why I always wanted to talk about this stuff, because there's so much information out there. And then we talked about earlier, you get in these Twitter spaces and you hear somebody talk for 10, 15 minutes and they're talking nonsense. And it's
Yeah.
itching for you
Well,
to
it's the
say
nature of
something.
the Twitter spaces. You're
Yeah,
limited by time and yeah. For
yeah.
example, like the Veritas forum, or what's the other? I think it's Veritas. I don't know if it's Veritas. But there's the professor. I think I sent you the video. Professor from Iowa that spoke at Iowa State University in my college, and he was talking about the
Oh yeah,
historical
yeah, yeah.
Jesus, and he explained that there's all these ideas are just all these wacky ideas. He said these are not new. People in the 18th century
Been
promoted this
talking about it.
stuff.
Yeah, it's
But
none of
when
it's
you
new.
look
You're
at,
right.
you got to realize that there are 950 scrolls
Yeah.
compiled into a book. And people say, oh, the Catholic Church left out these scrolls. Okay, but because there are literally 950 or more, not to mention all the Gnostic Gospels, which there are more
Mm.
scrolls, there could be more that comes up in the future. We haven't possibly even found. For example, the library in Baghdad was completely destroyed by the Mongols, and they tried to preserve it. The Mongols, I mean the caliphate at the time, they weren't able to save all the scrolls, and the Mongols just burned the city down. But they spared some of the Christians, but they didn't spare the texts, of course. Mongols spared the Christians because they didn't see them as a threat because they didn't have any power at the time. But the Muslims did, and the Mongols were like, we're just going to destroy the whole city. People always talk about Library of Alexandria, but you forget that there's the Library of Baghdad was also pretty amazing. It was the heart of Islam, and
Timbuktu.
where yeah, and so I think there's probably more Dead Sea Scrolls, if you want to call them that, that probably got lost. They say that's why Constantine had to make a decision. He's like, okay, we got to figure out these scrolls. We have 950, and every one of these scrolls are probably written by at least one or two authors, and they're
Hmm.
probably the second edition. So it's complicated, and
Well,
that's why
most
you
of the
need
time it
linguistic
is.
anthropologists.
A lot of times
So
they say that these texts come from older traditional stories.
yeah, they are inspired by the pagan world to some extent. Egypt was the pagan world. And what we mean by pagan is the worship of angels and demons,
Mm.
okay, the lower gods. But Egypt had this belief that Egypt really was the first to believe in monotheism, the Aten, the sun god. Okay, doesn't mean they literally worship the sun. The sun was just a
Mm,
symbol, just as we use a triangle with an eyeball in the center to symbolize God and the
mm.
three natures or characteristics, attributes of God.
Okay.
So we use that symbology, which is derived from Egypt with the adoption of the Eye of Horus and the Great Pyramid. And I mean, not Ralph Ellis, Michael S. Heiser says the pyramid is sometimes associated with the Eden, and that is the mountain of God, as Ralph Ellis says it's associated with Mount Sinai. He says he found some linguistic connection that Mount Sinai really was the pyramids, and Moses went to the pyramids where that was an honor to the ultimate God. It wasn't just for the pharaohs. And this is where I argue in my Atlantis series that the pyramids are not just for any one pharaoh. I bet multiple pharaohs were using those pyramids, and they would lay the bodies in there. And once that dynasty died, the next pharaoh would take out the bodies, move it to the Valley of
Move
Kings, and then
somebody
put
else in.
their
Yeah.
father's body into the pyramid, and then take it out. And the next pharaoh, they
You
would
know what?
rotate
That makes
bodies.
sense. You know, that makes
And
sense.
it's a throne
Keep,
room, I think,
yeah,
too.
that makes sense. You know, keep the last king in tomb of the pyramids until the next king that's in charge passes away, and then we move that old king or queen to the
It's kind of like the
Valley of the
Vatican, sort
Kings.
of, yeah,
Yeah, that
of its
makes sense
time.
because if you think about it, I remember watching this documentary. I can't remember what it is, but once somebody becomes a king in Egypt, they immediately start building their tomb for them, like immediately.
Well,
As
yeah, some did. Yeah, I do agree that some pyramids are probably associated to one Pacific king,
oh
certain
no, no,
lust
I'm
of
not
us,
just the pyramids,
but
just tombs. Period, like in the
the three
valleys of
main
the.
pyramids, I do agree with Robert Bauval that I think there's definitely some master plan layout, because if I think that really is where Atlantis was. There was a main capital city, and as Plato says, there were multiple kingdoms, but there was one main center, and they all had to give homage, kind of like the Game of Thrones kingdoms. But over time, pharaohs get jealous of other pharaohs, and then they destroy their
Destroy their
writings, and then
work.
they
And
take
yep.
out their tomb and all that. So that's the
Mhm.
politics of the time. So yeah,
Yeah,
I
just
think,
imagine how that would happen today with the politicians and the presidency that we have today. Imagine how many people would love to erase that type of history. Oh man.
you got to put it in a geopolitical context too. People forget it's just, oh, it's all theological symbolism, esoteric ideas. No, no, there's a real history. There's real geopolitics here.
Yeah, there's a
There literally
reason why
was a
they did.
Garden of Eden.
Yeah, there's a reason why they recorded. Only so many people could read and write back then. Okay, so it was important for them to keep records of that. When they started noticing that people were raping and pillaging and destroying their history, that's when it started becoming, hey, now we got to start hiding our information a little better, putting it in different words, changing how things
Yeah.
are so nobody can actually determine what we're talking about. That type of stuff. Yeah, it all makes sense and it all clicks with me
Well,
because.
I wouldn't say they were totally hiding it. They were
Well, no,
making
of course not
a
hiding totally.
they see, back then they didn't write, the Jews didn't write history like, okay, at this king,
Yeah.
this date, this location. It's more like, yeah, it's more in a poetic way, as for their audience, whoever their
Yeah.
audience was in the temple. Like they would be reading these in the temple to their audience
hmm
and sending a political message. To this day, we do that. When they say prophets, prophet is just someone who speaks
hmm
to an audience. So they're presenting news, sort of like they're telling this warning to Babylon,
The
the
visions.
modern Babylon, that, oh, you're going to end up like the Garden of Eden, you're going to be
Yeah.
destroyed and all that. And same thing with Sodom, Gomorrah, or all these other stories. But it seems like there's some original source. And if you don't look at this or don't look at this symbolically, and you just look at the Middle East with a map, a satellite map, and you say, where's there a giant freaking green space? Oh, Egypt. Okay, how long has that been there? Oh, well, according to this geologist, it looks like the White Nile was connected to Egypt around 12,000 years ago,
hmm
increasing the flow. Oh, what was the water level at the time? Oh, well, it was lower, about 300 feet. That makes the delta one third larger than it is now.
That's how I
And
think.
that
That's how I be
what
thinking. The
so and then you
origins of
compare that,
everything.
yeah, you compare that to Mesopotamia. Say, okay, did Mesopotamia have volcanic silt? No, they didn't. Okay,
Yep.
so that's why it's not as agriculturally lush. That's why the kingdoms were a lot more warring, and a lot of smaller city states scattered throughout between the two rivers.
yep.
So it just kind of makes sense that it's literally in the shape of a snake too, the snake motif. rivers and snakes are always associated. The word python, because rivers they snake around. That's where the phrase comes from. And then you have to say, well, why can't China be the Garden of Eden? Oh, okay. Well, what do you define as a garden? Okay, because you could say, let's say the Mississippi River. Mississippi River Valley is kind of like Egypt in some sense. You have this flat region where it floods and it's agriculturally suitable for Cahokia and all the mound builders. And then up on the plateaus, about 100 to 200 feet up high on either side, there's these cliffs.
Mhm.
And in those plateaus, there's woodlands. Okay, so the woodlands were like the Eden. They can be seen as a desert because
Mhm.
there's big trees in the way. There's bears in there. There's wolves. It's unsafe. It's
Right.
not open fields,
Right.
flat lands. So to the
Mhm.
mound builders, the Mississippi was the Garden of Eden to their culture.
Right.
But to our whole civilization, when it comes to the origins of steel, the origins of chariots, the origins of writing and language, it's definitely pointing back to the Middle East and Egypt.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
Yeah.
You know, I think we need to talk about the Egyptian pyramids next.